Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes from my History 151 course at Purdue University North Central. This is the first part of a three-part lecture on class and the American Revolution with an economic progressive interpretation. In part 1, I discuss the basic outlines of the historiography of the Revolution. For some, the Revolution was just a simple event of the oppressed fighting tyranny, but for many historians it was a more complex set of events that must be taken in context. These two interpretations continue to hold weight in our social memory, and that is because of because of how the historiographical interpretations have emerged over time. Historiography is the history of the writing of history. Understanding historiography helps us understand why ideas about the past change, at the same time as giving us more insight into what the past might have looked like. Historians in training must accept that the past as it was is unknowable, but we can reconstruct it in some manner to create a usable past. Since times change, what is usable changes as well. So the history of the American Revolution starts with those men we call the Founding Fathers, or less gendered, the Founders. The Founders were acutely aware of the fact that they were participating in historic events, and most of the men involved wanted to see their contributions remembered. Thus they did an impressive job of saving documents and perpetuating their ideas about the Revolution in the early national period. The meaning of the Revolution and the holders of its true legacy was debated for many years by Americans, from Jefferson and Hamilton to others going right into the Civil War. History was not a profession in the United States until the late 19th century, and those scholars were trained in Europe and were focused on the English and European contributions to American democracy. They were also quite political in their discussion of events. By the turn of the century, however, as the nation matured and changed, so did the American historiography about the Revolution. Western historian Frederick Jackson Turner refocused American history to the land and experiences on the North American continent instead of across the Atlantic. By the Progressive Era, reformers attempted to reshape the United States and clean up politics, the cities, the ranks of immigrants, and the factories. Workers, consumers, and even middle-class Americans realized that the growing gap between the poor and the rich were hurting the United States and giving a lot of power to and gave power to the socialist and anarchist movements, protesting the power of the elite, who had quite a bit of power. So they were protesting the power of the elite, the government, and the industrial order over their lives. For historians, this brought a new concern for the fate of the nation and looked to the history of the Revolution in a new light. They found that there were, quote, serious economic and social antagonisms underlying the major events of the American Revolution at virtually every stage of its development, end quote. Thus, historians started looking at class conflict during the colonial era that led to a surging of resentment during the Revolution. But by the end of World War II and the advent of the Cold War, social ideas changed and were reflected in the historiography of the consensus school. During the Cold War, social differences were sublimated or put down by political concerns of making sure democracy triumphed over communism. Historians embarked on doing detailed studies of the politics of almost every colony. They focused on politics during the colonial period, and these men did not look for the social discontent that the progressives had found, and they were determined that the progressives put too much of their personal agenda into their reading of past events. Now this may be true, but the consensus historians were doing the same thing. Cold War ideas persisted, but the protests of the 1960s realigned American thought once again to the social issues. Americans advocating for civil rights of blacks, Mexicans, Indians, women, and eventually homosexuals, as well as those who clung to the social order of the post-war era, were forced into a tense but productive conversation about government, social issues, and politics. This again rippled into the academic minds of writers. Historian Gordon Wood said about the Revolution that there was, quote, something profoundly unsettling going on in society, end quote, in the English colonies. His words about the revolution came at a time when there was something profoundly unsettling in his own era. Out of this time, historians influenced by the New Left started writing histories with these events in mind, and we call this the New Social History. In reaction to the protests and perceived changes in the moral order, Americans then elected Richard Nixon, who promised the silent center of America would see a return to law and order. Conservative hold on the government was interrupted by the Watergate scandal, but by the 1980s, Ronald Reagan injected into the political arena a rhetoric focused on morality, patriotism, and a triumphant democracy. This brought some scholars back to the consensus school with minor modifications. Consensus historians did not spend time disputing the role of the federal government in American life because, well, the federal government had saved Americans from starvation during the New Deal. Because of the New Deal during the Great Depression, the federal government had won the Second World War and waged a good and proper fight against the communists. So the consensus historians and the neoconservatives had a different viewpoint on the federal government, but they definitely had a very similar viewpoint on the revolution. Neoconservative historians were more concerned with the role of the federal government and were divided in their approach to it. And they saw great hope in the revolution of one of fighting tyranny. And now all of a sudden the federal government could be the one that was tyrannical. So as of this moment, the New Left and neoconservative schools of historiography are existing side by side, with educators teaching students one or the other based on their educations and backgrounds. As Colin Gordon noted in an essay on the topic, historians of America tend to be intellectual nationalists. They are, after all, both students and citizens of the society in which they live. In other words, it is hard to seem critical of the best nation on earth. But as I tell my students, and I will tell you, we can criticize because that is the freedom we were given, even if it means looking at the dark side of the past. We cannot understand our future without a clear understanding of our history. And for me and many of my generation of historians, that means looking at the social, political, and economic power structures as they were. Complex. For some of you, that will be more than you wanted to hear, but it does explain why there are different interpretations of the American Revolution. I will continue with a neo-progressive interpretation for the rest of this lecture, Part 2 and Part 3. And this lecture will not go into particular depth in regards to any one topic, but try to provide an interpretive, critical analysis of events. Please use your textbook for details about these events. That is a basic review of the major trends in historiography and what you will see in the next two parts of this lecture. And I hope this will help you reach a more sophisticated interpretation of the American Revolution, whether you take all or part of these different interpretations. If you have not listened to Part 2 or Part 3 yet, please do so for specific examples on how the economic-based interpretation can be applied to events.